Well, I want to start by giving you a chance. Some of you, I think, for the last 4 weeks have been trying something to make more space in your life, or you tried for a week and then you gave up or whatever. But I'd love for you at your tables to maybe catch people up if they weren't at the last session, and then also maybe share your experience in your attempt to make a little bit more space in your life and how that went. We're not expecting that it went wonderfully or was super easy. Like if it was, it's kind of like, why weren't we already doing this? Like there was probably some tension. So like you talk about that. Okay, so take 5 minutes and just catch each other up. So as Ethan said, I think one of the heart behind a lot of this is realizing that to love, which is the greatest commandment, love takes time. And so we have to be intentional with making space so that we can love well and intentionally. I think there's also this idea that the Christian way of living is a different way. It is countercultural to what we see around us. And so I think that I'm becoming more and more convinced that I don't think that you can live in the kingdom of God and live a life of speed. Like I just don't think they're compatible. I think they're in tension with one another. And so in this session, we're going to look at some historic practices and specific practices that either help you make more space in your life or bring more intentionality or clarity, focus to the space that you've made. And so the practices that we're going to talk about are often called spiritual disciplines, which this is made up of 2 words. Spiritual, I feel like sometimes can have this, we think that this means this like unseen, otherworldly sort of pursuit. But we're human. So the only type of spirituality that we can know is a physical spirituality. That is what Jesus was. He was a spirit-filled human. And so when we see the word spiritual, this isn't this idea of like practices that help us escape our bodies, but more help situate us within them. They help align our soul and our physical bodies in how we live throughout our day. Okay. Discipline, this is never a fun word. We hear that and we think punishment, or like hard work and like getting like exercising or something. But I've tried to use this in parenting actually. And instead of thinking about discipline, thinking like the word discipline is like discipling, right? That's more of what we're talking about. This is, we're being guided and we're learning wisdom of how to exist. That's what this discipline is, a rod and staff to protect and comfort me. Like there's a father who is loving us in this. One way to approach spiritual disciplines, I told you last week that I've used a lot of John Mark Comer's stuff from Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And he talks about how when you read someone's biography, a lot of times you read people's biographies who it's like a good, like someone who's very successful. And so you read it to think about like, oh, like this is what they do every day. And they went to this school and then they did this. And then you try to like take on those habits, right? Because you want to succeed like they succeeded. And he makes the point that like the Gospels are biographies of Jesus. We should read them like biographies and we should look at what he does and we should do those things. And so he likes, instead of spiritual disciplines, he likes to call them practices or habits of Jesus. And I think that, so when you think whether you like habits, practices, or spiritual disciplines, I'm going to let Dallas Willard define what this means. He says that the disciplines are activities of mind and body purposefully undertaken to bring our personality and total being into effective cooperation with the divine order. They enable us more and more to live in a power that is, strictly speaking, beyond us, deriving from the spiritual realm itself. You think about like a trellis where plants can grow up on. They give us a framework, right? The end goal is not just the trellis, right? The end goal is that you have these plants growing on it, right? If your end goal with the disciplines is to just have them, you're going to live a really frustrating and annoying life. But if the end goal in these disciplines is to have a life with Jesus, then I think these will be that means, right? And the goal isn't even to get the vines to grow up in nice, neat, nice rows. If you think further down, like the goal is to get the produce from that, whether it's like grapes and you have grape juice or wine. But like the idea is like the success of the trellis is when you have the fruit of it, right? And so that's what you have to understand these disciplines as they're producing fruit eventually. You're producing fruit because of them. And so Jesus doesn't actually give us a ton of clear direction on how to do these disciplines. He just does them and then he says, follow me. These, and if you think about, some scholars will talk about the idea of like follow me is actually a better translation would be apprentice under me. So recognizing like as a disciple of Christ, like we're actually an apprentice, like we're looking at Jesus and trying to figure out like, oh, like that's how he lives life. So I'm going to try to live life like that. So the first discipline we're going to look at is silence and solitude. It seems like the only place that we get to be alone with our thoughts anymore is the shower. And that will go away when our devices become waterproof. And so I feel like tech is robbing us of our ability to be present to God and to others and even to our own soul. Andrew Sullivan writes, there are books to be read, landscapes to be walked, friends to be with, life to be fully lived. This new epidemic of distraction is our civilization's specific weakness, and its threat is not so much to our minds, even as they shapeshift under the pressure. The threat is to our souls. At this rate, if the noise does not relent, we might even forget we have any. Ronald Rolsheiser says we are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. So I want to look at the Gospel of Mark. Jesus, at the very beginning of Mark, he is baptized, and then he goes into the wilderness. The Spirit compelled Jesus to go into the wilderness where he was tempted by Satan for 40 days. The word wilderness, eremos, I think in Greek, is, okay, thanks, John. It can mean a lot of, like, it can mean desert, wilderness, a deserted place, a desolate place, a solitary place, a lonely place, quiet place. And so I think it's easy to confuse the wilderness or this isolated place as a place of weakness. Like we think Jesus went there, now he's like super vulnerable, and so Satan like pounces at that point. But I think that actually the wilderness is the place of strength for Jesus. And it's why throughout the gospel, he keeps going back to the wilderness. It's the same word you'll see when it says he goes away to a solitary place, like same word. He had clarity about his identity, his calling. He was centered, he was grounded. On his first day of ministry, he teaches in the synagogue. He heals Peter's mother-in-law. He heals people who are sick and demon-possessed. And he must have been exhausted. But then in later, right after that, the next morning, it says before daybreak that the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. It's the same word. And so, I mean, he's spent like a month and a half in the wilderness, and then he's on the job one day, and he goes right back to the wilderness, right? Because he knew it was a place of strength. Just imagine, I'm thinking about my own life. Just imagine if Jesus didn't go to the wilderness after his baptism and Satan came to tempt him in that first day of exhaustion. Just like thinking about when you pull away, like that's the time where it's like, okay, like we can have this testing, but it's when you're exhausted that, you're doomed, right? So I want to break down, when we talk about silence, I think that there are two types of silence. There's external silence and there's internal silence. I think external silence, that's pretty easy to think about. The internal noise, I guess, is that ongoing mental chattering, the replaying of things, that monologue that you have in your mind. And I think that's harder. That's like a beast that has to be tamed. I think it starts though with taming the external noise so that then you can get to the internal noise. So the kind of silence I think we're called to is to be able to silence both of them. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where I am. Yes, okay. Because I think sometimes we use external noise to shove down and suppress the internal noise. So I think if we take away the external noise, we're going to start to identify a lot more internal noise that is where the real work happens. Then the other thing that we're talking about is solitude. And solitude doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't mean escape. Solitude is when you open up yourself to God, setting aside time to feed and water and nourish your soul, to let it grow into health and maturity. Foster says that loneliness is inner emptiness. Solitude is inner fulfillment. So we're anything but alone when we're in solitude because we're with God. And then Comer says that if our theory is right then, and the problem is more our absence than his, and more about our distraction than his disconnection, then the solution is fairly simple. Create an environment for attention and connection to God. And I know no better place than the wilderness or being pulled away, right? Solitude. Henry Nouwen says, without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. That's just a pretty straightforward down to it. There's a saying in parenting literature that to a child, love is spelled T-I-M-E. And I think that's true even in our relationship with God. There has to be time spent together. And when we don't practice this Jesus soul habit, we reap the consequences. So if it's helpful to read along, you can, but you could also close your eyes and just kind of hear this, because it's kind of like a narrative, a progression, okay, of what happens when you have endless noise. So first, we feel distant from God and end up living off somebody else's spirituality via a podcast or a book or one-page devotional we read before we rush out the door to work. And then we feel distant from ourselves. We lose sight of our identities and callings. We get sucked into the tyranny of the urgent, not the important. We feel an undercurrent of anxiety that rarely, if ever, goes away. The sense that we're always behind, always playing catch up, never done. Then we get exhausted. We wake up and our first thoughts are, already? I can't wait to go to bed. We lag through our days, our low-grade energy on loan from our stimulants of choice. Even when we catch up on our sleep, we feel a deeper kind of tired. Then we turn to our escapes of choice. We run out of energy to do what's actually life-giving for our souls, say prayer, and instead we turn to the cheap fixes. We become easy prey for the tempter, just furthering our sense of distance from God and our souls. Then emotional unhealth sets in. We start living from the surface of our lives, not the core. We're reactionary. The smallest thing is a trigger, a throwaway line from the boss, a snide comment from a coworker, a suggestion from a spouse or roommate. It doesn't take much. We lose our tempers, bark at our kids, get defensive, sulk, feel angry or sad, often both. So you think about that idea of that disposition. And so then when Jesus says, are you tired, worn out? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. And so now I want to give you a narrative on the other way, the more hopeful way of solitude. So again, if you want to read or if you want to close your eyes, we find our quiet place, wherever that may be, and we come away. We take our time long enough to decompress from all the noise and traffic and stress and nonstop stimulation of modern society. Sometimes all we need is a few minutes. Other times an hour isn't enough. Other times we gratefully take what time we can get. We slow down, breathe, come back to the present. We start to feel. At first, we feel the whole gamut of human emotions, not just joy and gratitude and celebration and restfulness, but also sadness and doubt and anger and anxiety. We face the good, the bad, and the ugly in our own hearts, our worry, our depression, our hope, our desire for God, our lack of desire for God, our sense of God's presence, our sense of his absence, our fantasies, our realities, all the lies we believe, the truth we have come home to, our motivations, our addictions, the coping mechanisms we reach for just to make it through the week. All this is exposed, and painfully so. But rather than leaking out of those we love most, it's exposed in the safe place of the Father's love and voice. In our ears, we sense his voice cut through the cacophony of all the other voices, which slowly fade to the deafening roar of silence. In that silence, we hear God speak his love over us, speak our identities and callings into being. We get his perspective on life and our humble, good places in it. I want that. I prefer the second story, right? So I hope you feel kind of the weight of the significance and importance of silence and solitude. Andrew Sullivan says that modernity has slowly weakened spirituality by design and accident in favor of commerce. It downplayed silence and mere being in favor of noise and constant action. The reason we live in a culture increasingly without faith is not because science has somehow disproved the unprovable, but because the white noise of secularism has removed the very stillness in which it might endure or be reborn. He continues, if the churches came to understand that the greatest threat to faith today is not hedonism, but distraction, perhaps they might begin to appeal anew to a frazzled digital generation. So I just want to give you, I'm going to share my process with solitude, and then I've asked some others to share too. Because I have young girls in the house, and they sleep pretty well, but some nights they don't, and you never know when it will be. And so Jordan and I, we found ourselves, like, we'd put the girls to bed and then we'd want to stay up late, right? To like have our finally like silence and solitude. But after some time, we realized like this isn't working. Like we're exhausted. And so any silence or solitude or attempt like is a huge failure when we try to do it at the end of the day. So then I realized, oh gosh, this means I have to get up earlier before everyone else. And so at first, this was really difficult for me, but I lined it up with the time change, which is coming up again, so that when we like fell back, like it wouldn't feel as exhausting to me. And so anyway, I decided, okay, 90 minutes before anyone else wakes up, I'm getting up every day And no matter, even if it's a Saturday, like every day of my life, I'm getting up at this time. And so I started doing it. And it was like within a week that I said to Jordan, I was like, I will never stop doing this. Like this, my life has changed. I felt like I could hear the inner voice finally again. For the 3 years that Evie had been born, like I felt like I had lost that. And so finally I felt like I found that. And so in giving up that extra sleep in the morning, it actually very quickly was, I realized this needs to keep happening for me in my season of life right now. So then, Tana, I wanted you to. Yeah, you can sit. That's fine.
So Daniel had asked about silence and solitude, but for me, behold, it helps if you click the button. So what I realized for me was that obedience was an issue, more so than the silence and solitude, but it then affected my time. I was struggling with reading God's word and listening. And I went to see Pastor Steve, and we talked about some really great ways to interact with God. He even talked about some of the things in his sermon this morning. Steve isn't going to see this, is he? Because I didn't think it was that helpful. But I now know that that's because I wasn't being obedient to something that God had asked me to do for years. So like I knew he was asking me to give up watching TV for me. And I talked myself in and out of that and tried to work around it for a long time. And then some other things happened this summer that I think God was working in my heart. We were away in Canada, and when I came home, I chose to be obedient to what God was asking me to do. And several things changed, but specifically, my time alone with him was radically affected. I used to read, a verse, say a prayer, wish there was more, and then be done, right? And so I have a journal that a good friend gave me in 2012, and I have journaled my prayers in that journal, and I have used more pages in that journal since July than I did from 2012 to 2024. So I'm now able to implement some of the ideas that Pastor Steve gave me. And what I learned was that obedience to what Jesus is asking has ripple effects that I didn't even realize. I know that he knows what's best for me. And so he wasn't asking me to do anything crazy, but he knows what I needed and what was best for me. So this is interesting because I feel like this is what Steve said this morning. God had been stirring things in my heart for years, but I hadn't obeyed. I had disobeyed. And the consequences of obedience for me has been a hunger to spend time with him, to read his word, and to journal my prayers. So
thanks, Hannah. John, would you share some of your habits?
Yeah, we didn't plan this to sit next to each other. Just happened. It came out already so beautifully in what Tana shared, and Daniel hinted at this already, that I've found this kind of this reinforcing cycle between desire and discipline, Sometimes it takes sort of taking on an act of obedience, trying something different that you feel invited to, or that a friend invites you into, just out of some sense of duty or whatever. That's okay, because like she just said, then the hunger gets stirred, right? And then the desire kind of can take over, and then vice versa. The clarity about what disciplines to take on emerge out of that desire, right? So that's the kind of cycle. We were talking earlier when we were sharing about how, like, when I go on a retreat and like put my phone away, like when I try harder to manage my phone usage, it gets better for a day or two maybe. But when I go on a retreat, even just a daytime retreat, put the phone away and actually turn it off, not the ringer off, right? And when I do that, even just for 7 hours on a day retreat, it stirs that desire to, like, because I'm like, this is how I want to live. And then the thought comes in, well, you can't. I'm like, yeah, but there's versions of this. I don't have to, the extreme other is not the only option, right? And so when I do that, so certain disciplines, like some time away from that phone, a block of it, actually stirs more desire. I mean, I know in a relationship like with my wife, which isn't the only model of connection with God, but it is one. In a marriage relationship, like if you just go on dates but never flirt, like in the week or the month, it doesn't work, right? But if you never go on dates, you never flirt, right? Like you have to have those blocks of time, which are actually easier to schedule, weird enough. Like we often go to these kinds of things as, I'm going to do this every day, and we do it for 4 days and then feel guilty when we quit doing it, right? But like the idea of like scheduling something between now and our next table ed, a block of time, maybe 2 hours. I started with 2 hours when I got started Sabbathing, silent solitude. It was 2 hours a week. That's it. I wasn't even going all out. Just, or maybe an afternoon, a block of time, 4 hours, or maybe even a day retreat, 9 to 4. That's what Ruth Haley Barton talks about, the 9 to 4 retreat, which is kind of saying, but I have to check in at work. Okay, check in from 7, from 8 to 9, and from 4 to 5, right? But block out a day. We all know how to do that with our teams. Sometimes we'll go away for a day, and it's so fun because you're not constantly emailing each other, but you're actually like working together on some project together. You're very present to that, and you can sometimes block that. Not all of us have jobs. My job doesn't work that way. I have to do it on a Saturday. When my kids were younger, that was harder, but is that making sense? So it's kind of like blocking out some kind of time to stir the desire. So it's a discipline to set aside the time, but then the time set aside stirs the desire for a different way of living. And then I just experiment. And then that's the big theme that I found, is just experimenting. So when I first the first silence I really experienced in terms of daily silence was meeting with a friend every day. And by every day, we met 4 days a week, right? That's it, just Monday through Thursday. And we met in the morning for 25 minutes and sat together in silence. And I was able to be silent just to not bother him. And he was doing the same thing, right? And we learned, week or two in, somebody texts, hey, I'm not going to be there today. And we decided, don't text me and tell me you're not going to be there, because if I show up and you're not there, who cares? I'm going to hang out with God. Great, because I'm not there to be with you anyway. Right? So that was an example of like shared silence, because trying to do silence and solitude together was always very hard for me, right? So to practice some silence with one other person was really helpful.
Nice.
And vice versa, like in silence to read some scripture, to not always try to go all the way into the combo. The combo's better, but it's hard to get there except on like a retreat sometimes, in my experience. But okay, that's just some of my stories.
Thanks, John. On your worksheet, I want you to take just like 2 minutes. I tried to make it look like a speaker. I don't know if it actually does, but there's external noises that come to your mind, like just throughout your week. Like where does noise come from? And then some of you might be able to identify also like the internal noise, where the internal noise comes from. So just take like 2 minutes, think through that, and then as you do that, like then move maybe to start thinking about like, what would it be like to cut out some of these noises? Okay, start brainstorming about that. After 2 minutes though, you can, as a table, you could discuss and say out loud some of your ideas and share that. And I'll give you probably like 5 or so minutes to do that. Okay, so right now in silence, think through all the noises, and then I'll tell you when you can start discussing. If one of the ideas stood out, or as you discussed, someone said something like, ooh, that resonated with me, go ahead, like write that down or circle the idea that you're like, for the next 4 weeks before the next the last table ed session, I want to try this, okay? Just so you can remember that. There's also a QR code here. John Mark Comer has videos on the disciplines that you could watch. He kind of even walks through like what you could do within solitude and silence, if that's helpful. That's there. The next one we're going to talk about has to do with solitude and silence, or at least like decluttering the noise in our life to some extent. But I want you to think about the feeling that you feel if you were listening to like a really big song and like right before the last note, it gets cut off. Like you feel that? I think that is the definition of the human condition. Like we know there's more, and we want to hear more. We want to hear the final note, right? And so we spend our whole life chasing after that final note. It's like we're chronically unsatisfied, right? No matter how much we see or do or buy or sell or experience, there's always this desire for more. But all of these things that we're chasing after are other created things that are not actually satisfying and fulfilling. And so it's kind of like the end of the song just keeps playing and playing, but actually never ends. And that's because, as St. Augustine said, you've been made, or God made us for himself, and so our heart is restless until it rests in him. Like he is the final note. Like he's where all the satisfaction comes from. Because our satisfaction is infinite. Or like we are finite, and like, but the only way we're satisfied is if we're satisfied in him. And so this, I think, has become even harder in a world that is inundated with advertising, who's always like, we're always being told like we don't have enough, we don't have that, we don't have that version. And this assumes that satisfaction only comes through addition, which is a big assumption. But then social media is another thing where now like you're seeing other people's like curated pictures of the best parts of their life. And so envy or just the possibilities of what your life could be, it's always there around us. And I think that this feeding of this, like, there's always more that I want that I could have, creates this crisis of emotional health and spiritual death. And so what we're going to talk about is Sabbath. In Hebrew, the word is Shabbat, which literally means to stop. The Sabbath is a day to stop working, to stop wanting, to stop worrying, just stop. And if you look, advertisements are selling Sabbath. Like they add beaches and bathrobes and like palm trees and stuff. But like what you're seeing is just people who have stopped. They're not working, they're resting, right? And so you can have what they have without the bathrobe and without the pool, and none of those things are bad, but that's the thing that we actually are desiring. We just need to stop. Walter Brueggemann said that people who keep Sabbath live all 7 days differently. I think that's the goal of this discipline. It's not just to have one day set aside, but that setting aside affects how we live the rest of our days. This is Comer has this in his book, this comparison of restfulness versus restlessness. You can see like a life that is defined by restfulness versus a life defined by restlessness. I like this side better. But these things don't just happen, and that's what we're talking about. Like these disciplines are ways to cultivate this disposition in our life. In Mark 2:27, the Pharisees kind of call him out on the Sabbath and how he's not doing it right. And Jesus says to them, the Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. And in the first century, I think that what they needed to hear was that second part, that not like humans weren't created for the Sabbath, because it had become kind of become very legalistic. And so this idea of like, we have to do this and this is how it's done. And like, you can't do this, but you can do this, and all of those sorts of things. But today, we're not as legalistic. I remember like growing up where a lot of stores in the town would be closed. That's changed a lot, I think, in the last couple of decades, where now I don't really feel like there's many at all, like much difference. I think more in Marion, I think more stores are closed on Monday than on Sunday. But I think that the Sabbath, well, I'll let Swoboda, I think he has I'll read it, but I wanted to put, because this is just if you're curious. There, okay. He writes that the Sabbath has largely been forgotten by the church, which has uncritically mimicked the rhythms of the industrial and success-obsessed West. The result? Our road-weary, exhausted churches have largely failed to integrate the Sabbath into their lives as a vital element of Christian discipleship. It's not as though we do not love God. We love God deeply. We just do not know how to sit with God anymore. We have become perhaps the most emotionally exhausted, psychologically overworked, spiritually malnourished people in history. And so the argument is that I think in today's culture, like we need the first part of this. We need to remember that the Sabbath was made for humanity. When you think about the creation narrative, God blessed the day and made it holy because he rested on it, and all his creating work had been completed. And so I think it's unique to recognize like God is resting, right? Like that's a significant thing. And Comer has this exchange where it's like, yeah, I'm not really into Sabbath. I'm an extrovert and I just like to stay busy, and God rested. Yeah, I get the Sabbath thing, but I work a demanding job that I love, and I just can't make the time because God rested. Yeah, but I have 2 little kids at home, and it's just not really a doable thing right now. Maybe later when he said, do I need to say it again? God rested. Like, do we think that we are above God in that? Like, God rested, and he created this day of rest for us. He built it into the DNA of creation. This weekly rhythm of work and rest. So when we fight against this rhythm, we're fighting against the grain of the universe. There's a philosopher who says like, if you go against the grain of the universe, you're going to get splinters, right? And I think some of the things on that other side of the list, like those are the splinters that we get. God blesses 3 things in the creation narrative. He blesses animals to be fruitful and multiply, and then he blesses humans, same thing, be fruitful and multiply, and then he blesses the day, Sabbath. Meaning that I think that just like animals and humans, that the Sabbath has the life-giving capacity to procreate, to make more life in the world if we observe it. This fascinates me. I don't know how much you know about Seventh-day Adventists. There was a research study that was done, and Seventh-day Adventists observe the Sabbath day very religiously. And one of the things that came out in the study was that on average, Seventh-day Adventists live 10 years longer than other people. And Comer does the math, and he's like, if you add up every Sabbath for a lifetime, it equals about almost exactly 10 years. So he just says like any Sabbath that you observe, like you're going to get that time back. And he jokes he's going to observe Sabbath 3 times a week. But but I think the point though that he makes is this idea of like there's a rhythm to life, and we think that if we don't stop, like that we can just keep pushing through, like we can do it, we can get it all done. We'll just like work harder, we'll stay up later. But then like our body reacts to it. Like we get tired, we get colds, our nervous system starts to break down. Like the Sabbath in a sense is coming for us, whether it's a delight or a discipline, right? Like our body is built to rest, and so it's gonna happen. And so maybe this is why God actually made it a command eventually. He said, 6 days you'll do all your labor, all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. To the Lord your God means like this idea of like it's set apart for the Lord, or it's dedicated to the Lord. So it's not just a day of rest, but it's a day of worship, a day of orienting your life to God. I'm not going to say this next slide, and maybe on the live stream we'll blur it out. But Eugene Peterson he makes the point that a day off is not the same as a Sabbath. And that's what he calls it. He said that it's a day off is the illegitimate child of the 7th day in Western culture. But on a day off, you may not work for your employer, though you might still. We still work. We run errands. We catch up on things around the house, pay bills. But we do play. We like see movies or hang out with friends, and we do all these things, like activities that need to happen or should happen or are good. But on a Sabbath, we rest and we worship. And those are pretty broad categories. I think different personality types will understand resting and understand worship as like what that means for you. Like a household with kids all under 5, like our Sabbath is going to look different than someone who is older or single or retired or whatever. Like, yeah, it's different. But worship and rest, that's what a Sabbath is. And this will take intentional work. You don't just arrive at the Sabbath and then like, okay, it's Sabbath. Like, no, like you still have to get the groceries at some point. And so if Saturday or Sunday, whatever Sabbath day you would want to observe, like you don't just show up and like, oh gosh, we need food. Like you have to make a plan for it, right? So you're gonna have to like, we do groceries on like this night or whatever, Jordan and I, something that's helped us is to think through, we compare Sabbath to like Christmas Day, a holiday. It's like, would we do this on Christmas? If we wouldn't do it on Christmas, then we're not going to do it on Sabbath. Because it's like, you still have to eat on Christmas Day, but you've pre-planned the meal so that you're not like, oh, what should we eat today, right? You've done the grocery shopping beforehand. So it's like, you just get to enjoy the day, but it took work to get there. So on one hand, rest and worship, but then there's this other idea, and well, I'll go to this first. So it's interesting in Exodus, when the Sabbath is introduced first as a command, the reason it says, remember the Sabbath. And the reason is because in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that was in them. But he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Based in the creation narrative, this idea of like the day brings life, right? But then in Deuteronomy, the reason for the Sabbath is based in the Exodus narrative. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. This was the first generation of free Israelites who were hearing this one. Their parents and grandparents were slaves in Egypt. But the Israelites hearing this, they're next to the Jordan River. They can see the promised land. And they're hearing this reason for the Sabbath is based in their history, the Exodus narrative. This is a different reason because slaves don't get a Sabbath. Slaves work all the time. They don't get a day off. They are treated subhuman. And I think that we would all agree in some sense, like Egypt is still alive today in this ever increasing requirement to accomplish more in whatever our job is or whatever we do. There's always more to be done, always greater expectation on what we could accomplish. And so in this sense, Sabbath is an act of resistance to our culture. Comer says that Pharaoh would love the USA. Sabbath is a way of saying enough. Buying things isn't always bad, but most of us have more than enough to enjoy a rich and satisfying life. And so Sabbath is a day for us to say with the psalmist, I lack nothing. Under the Torah, there was a law that buying and selling were off on the Sabbath. And so this is a practice to break away from the twin gods of accomplishment and accumulation. There's a limit. At some point, we have to be able to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm good. I have enough. I don't need another whatever. What I really need is time to enjoy what I already have. Comer says the Sabbath is like a guerrilla warfare tactic. If you want to break free from the oppressive yoke of Egypt's taskmaster and its restless, relentless lust for more, just take a day each week and stick it to the man. Don't buy, don't sell, don't shop, don't surf the web, don't read a magazine. Oh, that bathtub would look nice upstairs. Just put all that away and enjoy. Drink deeply from the well of ordinary life. A meal with friends, time with family, a walk in the forest, afternoon tea. Above all, slow down long enough to enjoy life with God, who offers everything that materialism promises but can never deliver on, namely contentment. Ronald Rauschhauser says, we are restful when ordinary life is enough. So in my family's life, we started trying to do like a Sabbath dinner. So we'd like the day we'd have our phones away for a certain amount of time, and then we'd have people over in the evening. We realized really quickly this was not a good idea. It did not work because, especially when you have two young kids, when people are coming over in the evening, that means you have to keep the house clean all day long. And if naps don't go well or whatever, like evenings are just chaos. And so we found ourselves being very just like frustrated. And even meals in the evening are like, it's just like so many different things. And like, anyway, then I don't even know how we arrived at this, but I think it was in thinking through holiday. One of the things our families do is like, they always have like some sort of like cinnamon rolls or something in the morning. And so we're like, there is something like when you wake up on Christmas, it's like, ooh, like a quick like breakfast before you like open presents or whatever. And so Jordan and I were like, what if we tried Sabbath breakfast? Still invited people over, but it's like a breakfast, like, and we do that, like, we do basically the same exact meal every Saturday morning. And so like now we know how to like homemade pancakes, sausage, eggs, yogurt, like, and we can put that meal together in like 15 minutes because we've figured it out. But the girls wake up, they're happy. It's like the first thing in the morning. And so every week on Saturday morning, someone comes over to our house and we have this little Sabbath prayer that we say together. We light a little Sabbath candle and we have a meal together. And then after the meal, we go into the living room and we act out a Bible story, usually multiple times because Evie wants to be every character. And so once we get through that, and she usually assigns like who else is going to be a character and what they're going to do. But then we get through that, we sing Glory to God Forever, that song together. And then sometimes like depending on who it is, like they'll stick around, we'll like sit outside or we'll take a walk or whatever. And then eventually like they leave. And I think by like around noon, like we finally will go get our phones and be able to like have them or look at them. But we still won't do any work until later in the evening, like once the sun goes down, just because of our job, like we have to have our minds like wrapped around what we're walking into the next morning. So we found it really hard to like have that all like never touch it again after Friday. But we don't touch any of it until the sun goes down on Friday or Saturday. And so that's worked for us. We've done it for almost a year now. Our kids love it. Like Evie wakes up and it's like, who's coming over for Sabbath? Or they come in like Shabbat Shalom. Like she's really into it. So anyway, that's something we've done. I wanted Jana to share. I know you've wrestled with how to do this. So.
Yeah, Sabbath has transformed.
Oh wait, I turned it off. Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, you have a little thing. Okay. Test. Okay, yeah, Sabbath has changed for us over the years too. We started on Sunday after church because Sunday is Sabbath, so that makes sense. But it often felt really rushed. I don't know, it felt stressed. It didn't feel like a time necessarily that we could settle in. So we switched to Saturday dinner, and that went really well. Light candles, say a prayer, sometimes have people over. But then my middle daughter went to college, and so now it's kind of just my youngest son and me, and that's kind of awkward, like Sabbath with two people. I'm not saying we couldn't make it work, but it's a different feel. So actually probably inspired by the Rifes, we started inviting people over too. We talked about it. I said, what would you think about having people over on different weeks? And so that's what we're doing. And I feel like part of that, not just the meal, but setting that day apart, for me, it's an act of trust that I can accomplish in 6 days what the world says I need 7 to do. So I grew up, you can't this, you can't this, you can't do homework, but instead saying, you know what, we're gonna try to do those things ahead of time so that Sabbath can actually be a time of rest, I think has transformed how I see Sabbath.
Yeah, great, thanks. So now I'm just curious, thanks. I put a little stop sign, but there's like all these little like Christmas icons. I just wanted you to think through, maybe just for even like 30 seconds, when you think about a holiday, I mean, whatever, I don't know, what's big in your family, like what are some of the things that make that day special? How is that set apart? And maybe use that then to start your brainstorming of what a Sabbath might look like. Again, and like different seasons of life, if this is just 1 hour, you're like, we're going to do Sabbath 1 hour on this, like, great. If that's where you start, like, so just start thinking about what are those things that help set a day apart. And then once you make that list, like move down to start coming up with some ideas that you could try. Again, I'll give you a couple minutes and then I'll let you discuss as a group together. Okay? Go for it. In our attempt to take on Christ's yoke and to follow him, to let him teach us, I want to send you into these next 4 weeks with hopefully these habits that you've, or ideas that you've had, you're going to try. Again, like circle the ones that you want to do. There's, again, his video on Sabbath right here. There's also, the purple one is a workbook that he has that actually like kind of outlines things that you could do. Like he has texts or, passages you could read within your solitude or things like that. So if you are looking for more resources, go there. But I want to send you with this benediction as we seek to follow Jesus, our teacher. May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi.